So thank you all for being here. As Cosmin announced, the title of my lecture is History is not given, it has to be constructed. This motto of a long-term project East Art Map, initiated by Slovenian artist group Irvin, through which in collaboration with artists, curators, theorists and critics from ex-socialist European countries, they attempted to reconstruct art history of Eastern Europe after 1945 to the present. And the project, which in its first inception in 2001 was just a small artist publication, and then a website project, and finally 527-page scholarly book. This motto does not apply only to art history as Irvin proposed it, but also to the ways in which artists deal with charged, contested or suppressed issues of history. Obviously, this perspective is not pertinent only for artists working in today's gloomy, depoliticized, post-socialist context, stuck in nationalistic mythologizations and the blunt affirmation of the existing state of affairs, which is a context of Croatia, a country I'm coming from, but obviously applies to artists working anywhere. But for us, and I'm using plural here as I refer to the work of curatorial collective WHW, which we actually pronounce VHV in a Croatian pronunciation of English abbreviation of What, How and For Whom, which is the title of a collective. And there are 4 of us working together since '99 doing curatorial projects. So for us, coming from a post-socialist Croatia, country that emerged out of a collapse of socialist Yugoslavia in 1991, soon to be followed by wars that between 91 and 95 raged in former republics of Yugoslavia. A country that since its beginnings struggled with its socialist past, at first trying to erase it completely from collective memory, later reluctantly accepting it in a normalized version of a broader narrative that understood communist revolution fought during the Second World War and subsequent decades of socialism as a consequence of misleading and foreign influence that for a while, and actually for 4 decades, infected the purity of national being and tore it away from its deep European core to which it supposedly always belonged. So in these circumstances, for us, the relation to past was always a kind of clearing historical grounds, having in mind possible future that is not completely absorbed with hegemonic narratives of the present, which for Croatia in the last 20 years obviously meant neoliberal capitalism, parliamentary democracy, rule of human rights, and so on and so on. We tried to link the experience of so-called collapse of communism, or to put it more precisely and probably less ideologically colored, collapse of Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War, out of which Western capitalist democracy appeared to emerge victoriously, and the changes it brought to societies affected by a process of a so-called transition. So we tried to link these processes to a diverse geocultural areas that struggled with certain traumas, like, for example, Latin America with its history of military dictatorship, whose social consequences were never completely resolved, nor perpetrators trialed, or Middle East, geopolitical area struggling with consequences of wars, betrayed social revolutions, and combination of both. I alluded here to post-socialist Europe, or former Eastern Europe, Latin America and Middle East as a kind of ghost geographies, whose existence is less a consequence of some historically contingent development that nowadays appears as essential and intrinsic, but rather a non-fixed result of geopolitical interests that often stem from one or the other form of colonial past, either straightforward colonial past, like in the case of Middle East and Latin America, or from economical form of semi-periphery or periphery of the world system, to use in Wallerstein terms. We always attempted to connect our projects to broader questions of so-called European identity and international solidarity, which for us was based on exploration of a discourse of East versus West, meaning power relations involved in cultural geopolitics that under proclaimed leveling of differences after the fall of Berlin Wall took it for granted that now post-socialist Eastern Europe could be seamlessly reintegrated into Western art world, from which it was forcefully and temporarily excluded by unnatural rule of communism. This was also the position expressed by the motto, "History is not given, it has to be constructed," which governed extensive research archiving project by Irvin, dealing with complicated process of inclusion of Eastern European art in Western narrative, assuming a more detailed view that takes into account different histories and realities of a non-homogeneous histories that for decades defined the art context. Details such as, to name just a few, position apart from art market, different understanding of trajectories stemming from history of historical avant-gardes and continuing to post-avant-garde practices, strong tradition of collective artistic practice and self-organizing, or a relation to state politics far more complicated than straightforward position of a dissident so much beloved in the West. Throughout our work, we kept very complicated relations to the subject of cultural geopolitics, parallel with marching internationalization of the art market that soon proved to be a complicated set of relations revolving around power, packaging, geopolitics, and career strategies, far away from a simple, straightforward form of dialogue or multiculturalism. For this talk, I was tempted to go into details of socio-political history of ex-Yugoslavia and present-day Croatia, because our curatorial work is very much rooted in that context, as we understand Yugoslavia as a case study for testing certain assumptions on socialism, modernization, modernism, and the violent dismantling of socialism in a kind of a shock doctrine, as Naomi Klein calls the strategy of neoliberalism, gaining momentum through exploiting crisis it creates. But I decided to omit the history lesson and will try to talk about the works of several artists whose practice was decisive for our attempts. What's this? I'm sorry, I guess it's annoying for you as it is for me. Okay, thank you. I don't hear it now. It should be better. Okay, good. So, I decided to omit the history lesson and will try to talk about the works of several artists whose practice was decisive for our attempts to work with history and with whom we worked consistently throughout the years. I'm planning to show several videos also, as I hope the direct experience of the works, although in these conditions it might not be ideal, but still, the direct experience of the works might fill in the gaps and blanks of my explication. So now I would like to start with the first video by Croatian artist Sanja Iveković. I will talk a little bit about it, then we start. Wait. So she's an artist born in 1949 and living in Zagreb, Croatia. Since the early 70s, her artistic practice explores and politicizes regimes of representations and ideological positions underlying them from the perspective of feminist critique. Today, internationally renowned and considered one of the key artists of her generation, she started at the margins not only of international art system, but also at the margins of Yugoslav art system. Iveković belongs to post-1968 artistic generation that in socialist Yugoslavia introduced what became known as new art practice, post-object conceptual art, which searched for alternative ways of production and presentation of art, redefined the status of art and ways of its mediation, and posed radical questions about the autonomy and the role of art institutions. This practice of new art practice presented a serious blow to modernist canon adopted as official art in the socialist Yugoslavia in the years following President Tito breakup with Stalin in 1948, which set the country on so-called independent road to socialism. But it would certainly take decades to dismantle it thoroughly, I mean modernism, modernist canon. actually longer than it took to dismantle the country itself, which violently broke up in 1991. Throughout her career, Sanja Iveković, from her early photography and performance through to the major collaborative and public projects of recent years, she kept her preoccupations with border between the public and private self, mediated visualizations of gender and political contents of privacy, always realized against the background of precise analysis of social and political forces that contextualize it within a particular set of circumstances, and at the same time situated within and against overreaching historical narratives. Her video Personal Cuts from 1982 that we will see now is in many ways topical. It consists of one continuous sequence in which a woman, the artist herself, is cutting holes into a black stocking that covers her face, with each cut followed by a short sequence of documentary footage taken from a TV serial made to celebrate 40 years of socialist Yugoslavia. So I suggest we see the video now. Okay. Maybe turn off the lights.
Ne 10 miliona kilovat-časova električne energije. Priredio je u Belom dvoru svečani prijem delova Jara Kostovića i Ostoje. I da ćemo učiniti sve što je mogućno da... When the chimes ring 5, 6 and 7.
Su skladnim pokretima izvele ritmičke igre. Biti serijski. Najviše
radnika nagrađeno novčanim nagradama.
kulturni i javni radnici Beograda. Snažan dojam ostavili su pitomci vojne. A minutu kasnije
čekam ja da proleće mi dalje.
Koja će postati tradicionalna manifestacija. Perlon spavačica, po kvalitetu ravna.
Tog dana shvatio sam nju.
Stop. And now So in personal cuts, self-representation is situated within a grand narrative of the socialist history of Yugoslavia, presented as cross-section of collective self-understanding, lightly modified and enhanced for the purposes of celebratory official self-representation on national television program. In Iveković's cut, documentary material consists of images of factories and industrial productivity, testifying to obsessions with progress, with confidence that display no concerns with economic crisis that since the early 70s was affecting Yugoslavian global economy. Images are often, as you saw, accompanied by optimistic and modern Western or Western-influenced music, suggesting Yugoslavia's cultural openness and independent way to socialism, characterized by non-alignment and workers' self-management. Through simple editing, images of harmonious society in which human emancipation is fully achieved, in juxtaposition with gradually revealed face of artist terrorists, reveal inner contradictions of society of ossified socialist ideals, exposed to bureaucratic measures that failed to enhance solidarity and equality, and then since the middle 70s, through a series of market reforms, were progressively abandoning socialism. The tension between the colorful and self-content picture that society had of itself and projected to the outside world, and the reality of deepening social inequalities and conflicts, in personal cuts stand against the image of the face of the artist as a witness and accomplice, in a gesture of exposure in self-representation that critically negotiates distances between self and the social order, but does not stand outside of it. For Iveković, like for numerous other artists, archive figure prominently as a way to approach the history, with exploration of the archive and the processing of its finds, and not being about documentation of the past, but rather about clearing the grounds for statements about the present and proposals for the future. This is certainly the case with Argentinian artist Graciela Carnevale, who in the last 10 years or so, or longer, or more specifically in the midst of the economic crisis that befell Argentina in 2001, and that resulted in national uprising and shook the country to its core, decided to present the archive of the collective project called Tucuman Arde, rescuing it from oblivion or sporadic scholarly interest at the moment when the weight of that exemplary project of political practice of art could renegotiate complex relations between memory and power, representation and truth, individual and collective actions, with acute awareness that memory, both personally reworked and officially recast and reinstalled, shapes present power constellations, constraining or enabling them, and influences concepts of legitimacy and justice. In one of our exhibitions in 2005, we showed Tucuman Arde archive, conceptualized by Graciela Carnevale, and she kept parts of the archive consisting of the photos, manifests, and documents through the period of dictatorship, and we showed it on several other occasions. And first time we showed it in the exhibition called Collective Creativity that we curated in Kunsthalle Fridericianum in Kassel in Germany in 2005. And I have several images from that particular installation of the archive. I will tell you a few words about the project. It's the Tucuman Arde itself. Tucuman is a primarily agricultural region in Argentina, known for production of sugar. The whole region was devastated by neoliberal policies of Argentinian government in the second half of the 60s that included massive privatization and centralization. So-called Operation Tucuman was the pilot project of government policies of the time. And that led to extreme social hardship, including massive unemployment, hunger, and increase in child mortality rate. Tucuman Arde actually means Tucuman burns. And it was a project done by artists from Rosario and Buenos Aires, who over a course of 2 years, from 1967 to 1969, worked on the research and counter-information campaign against government policies. Project consisted of intensive research in Tucumán and culminated in the exhibition organized in collaboration with trade unions in Rosario, Santa Fe, and Buenos Aires. This exhibition, which was called First Biennial of Avant-Garde Art, and here you could see the poster, had strong political and aesthetical program, and in Buenos Aires had to be closed after being open for just a few hours. After it, the military regime started investigating the group due to links between artists and unions, and the group itself dissolved. Most of the participating artists abandoned art practice for several years. Some joined guerrilla movement, some never returned to artistic activity. Graziella Carnevale was one of the members who kept large parts of the archive during the military regime, but also destroyed many of its parts, in fear of putting both artists and union leaders in danger. The rites that after more than 30 years she represents, constructs and reinterprets this archive through her individual eyes, as well as all the doubts that this is bringing, are reflected in the questions written by the artists on the wall as the part of the installation. And here you can see a little bit more of the installation itself. So it consisted of documentary material that was kept, of all the invitations and posters produced during these 2 years. On the map on the floor, map of the world in which north and south were reversed. Yeah, so this was it. And the text of the wall statement that was also included in the words by Graziella Carnevale, it goes as follows. This archive is the memory of an experience of a brief but intense journey that made us transit, both as individuals and as artists, a path of questioning, ruptures, and the conception of artistic practice as political practice. What is the meaning of showing the archive itself? How to narrate this experience? How to show works that have been produced in different contexts and circumstances? Is it possible to exhibit the operational complexity that was implied in this experience? Can these documents produce experiences that question the present? These questions that she put in relation to her personal reworking on Tucumán Arte Archive, I think resonate very much with all our dealings with history and archives. About the time when Graziella Carnevale re-entered art field and resurrected the archive of Tucumán Arte at the moment of political upheaval and the re-entering of the masses on the stage of the history, that also prompted a kind of resurfacing of political art practice in Argentina after 2001. Younger generation of artists approach history directly, like for example the group called Etc., collective formed in Buenos Aires in 1997 by a group of visual artists, poets, puppeteers, and actors. Etc. collective worked closely with the human rights group Hijos, Children for Identity and Justice Against Forgetting and Silence, and developing and popularizing so-called escraches, exposure protests, which were realized as stunning street performances protesting against the impunity granted to the perpetrators of genocide during the years of the military dictatorship in Argentina. What they would do basically was to make a performance, kind of theatrical performance that would expose the perpetrators of the crime that would live, that were living a completely safe life without exposing their identity, their crimes in the groups, in the neighborhood in which they live or among the people with whom they work. So they were really exposing crimes to the people, so that they were doing what the justice system failed to do because of the law. So they gave Etc. and many other activist artists groups that were working in those years gave to this process of escrache a kind of a face. But Etc. also worked with developing installation for the exhibitions, because what was important for them was to bring this discourse which was happening on the streets in a very politicized context of Argentina at the time, to bring this content into art institution. So, for example, in this same exhibition where we showed Graziella Carnevale and Tucumán Arde, we showed a project by etc. called Gente Armada, which is a play of words, and it means both armed and constructed people. So here they staged some of these experiences of the streets in the exhibition. And then they continued with projects which had nothing to do with the scratches anymore, and initiated something called Errorista movement. So on the occasion of the protest during George Bush's visit to Argentina and the summit of the Americas in Mar del Plata in 2005, they issued a manifesto called We Are All Errorists, which became the model for a worldwide political and philosophical movement that affirms error, compromise, confusion, and surprise as productive qualities in life. And in this image and here, you can see the installation they made for Istanbul Biennial exhibition we curated in 2009, which was called Errorist Cabaret, kind of a theater stage surrounded by various life-sized characters and images representing different members of the Errorist movement throughout international Errorist movement, also including a lot of images from history related to Istanbul or related to exhibition concept. Against positively charged political atmosphere of Argentina after uprising of 2001 and 2, uprising that was later channeled and normalized, but nevertheless prompted economic and political changes that a decade later, I mean today, proved to be powerful enough to push the country in the direction that dismantled many of neoliberal dogmas and achieved more equal and just distribution of political economic powers. So in comparison to Argentina at that time, post-socialist landscape appears rather gloomy. Perhaps here I would like to mention the works by Vyacheslav Akunov, an artist born in 1948 and living in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. From this very peripheral position, peripheral within the context of former Soviet Union and peripheral nowadays, he has been reworking the experiences of 1970s Moscow conceptualism and in the 80s organized pioneering happenings and actions. From 1974 to 1987, Akunov worked on a series of collages that used iconography typical of socialist propaganda. In a series called Lenin's Plan of Monumental Propaganda, or series Leniniana and the Doubts, they are all dedicated to the revolutionary leader Lenin. The artists used many sources to make his collages: books, art magazines, newspapers, albums, and posters. So here you see one from the series called Leniniana, or this one. So these are kind of collages. Representations of the famous leader are inserted into minimal drawings, creating an imaginary political landscape of a sort. Or in a series, this is Lenin's Plan of Monumental Propaganda, one of the collages from that series. And here are few from the series called Doubts, in which he used, these are watercolors, that are actually faithful small-scale replicas of original political propaganda posters, and the only intervention he did was to add question mark at the end. So this particular one I unfortunately don't understand, but here it says Marxism, Leninism, our knowledge, I think, and then question mark, like really. Or this one, it says Lenin, our leader, question mark. So this is series called Doubts, or there is a series called, so these are all made between middle 70s to middle 80s. This one is from the series called Stamps, and he uses social realist paintings, documentary photographs, and propaganda posters featuring Communist Party leaders like Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, all of them. And stencils have different political slogans and minimal interventions by the artists around the design. And in a way, they deconstruct the language of political rhetorics. the series outlines the narrative of the political history of Soviet Union. So there are a few more of them. And the last is the series called Flybeat Revolution. So he made the collages using this kind of thing to kill the flies. And then again inserted in it famous figures from Soviet signs and symbols, and portraits of revolutionary figures and members of Politburo, etc., etc. So this one is with Trotsky. And we visited Akunov in his studio in Tashkent at the beginning of 2009 when we were doing research in Central Asia for Istanbul Biennial. And in his own words, I mean, he claimed that we were the first curators who visited him in his studio, not the first people who came outside of the city of Tashkent. And for better or worse, after showing quite extensive selection of his works in Istanbul, and here you can see some of the installation shots in Istanbul, his works started to circulate quite a lot. And I'm saying for better or worse, as I allude to the lack of context, problematic dating, and insufficient interpretive tools that need to be developed to situate his works in relation to often oversimplified notions of Soviet dissident art in the 80s. However, in the curatorial framework of Istanbul Biennial, his works were functionally employed as a marker for certain political will, which the exhibition as a whole attempted to convey. We tried to show them as signs of artists' obsessiveness with the aesthetic of Soviet propaganda that pushes it beyond ironic subversion of the ideological apparatus, certainly beyond revisionism or nostalgia. And this obsessiveness that we understood as a sign that the relationships with communism remains open, maybe possibly also against artists' intentions. An artist whose relationship to communist past is more controlled, but no less ambiguous in the sense of being open, using past as something open to new interpretations and reworkings that have a bearing on the present and the way we could imagine the future, is artist called David Maljković, born in 1973 and living in Zagreb. His works confront us with forgotten or invisible heritage, or heritage that is not perceived as valuable at the moment. For example, in his broader dealing with modernism, and he mostly deals with Croatian modernism, he often works with the legacy of a group called Exit 51, an artist group active in Zagreb from 1950 to 1956. The group proposed to abolish the borders between high and applied art, emphasize the collective and experimental aspects of artistic practice. He also worked a lot with the legacy of modernist sculptor Vojin Bakić. He's a sculptor who lived from 1915 to 1992, an artist on one hand perceived as authentic modernist sculptor and the main proponent of the breakup with social realism after breakup with Stalin in 1948, and on the other hand as a state artist whose art has been servicing ideology. The problem comes from seemingly contradictory fact that since the early 50s, Bakić used the language of high abstract modernism to commemorate the anti-fascist partisan struggle and communist revolution during the Second World War. And this fact that he used high abstraction with the ideological content of Second World War, anti-fascism and communist revolution, this caused a lot of misunderstandings that need to be seen in the context of the 90s in Croatia, when more than 2,500 monuments commemorating positive history of anti-fascist struggle of socialist Yugoslavia were removed or destroyed. Among them, some of the best Vojin Bakić monuments. So, for example, here I have a series of photos from a sculpture which commemorated anti-fascist uprising of the people of Slavonia, one region in Croatia. The monument was built in 1969, and at that time it was the biggest abstract sculpture in Europe. And this is during the construction documentary footage, photos, and here you can see it when it was finished in 1969, and then during the war it was erased by Croatian nationalist right-wing forces which had a problem with anti-fascist heritage. It was destroyed, yes, and it took them several attempts to actually manage to really bomb it. And it's known who did it, but people were never charged with any crimes. And so this is one of the maybe the biggest example, because this was the biggest monument, but altogether 2,500 monuments commemorating anti-fascist history was destroyed in 10 years, during the 90s. So David Maljković worked a lot with this heritage. Problematic relations towards legacy of socialist decades of the society that has imposed collective mystification and oblivion to the archive of politics, economy, and style of the failed project of socialist society is certainly crucial for understanding the context of the reception of avant-garde modernism in the 50s. What we tried to argue we also made a solo exhibition of Bakić, because in the 90s he was very much forgotten and completely dismissed actually. And we made a little exhibition in the public gallery that we are running, which dealt with his heritage, which was kept with the family. And we wanted just to raise the issue of Bakić, and the exhibition was only was accessible only through the windows of the gallery, because we could not insure the works, but we also wanted to point, it was also a metaphor of curatorial practice, that this is a kind of heritage that you cannot really approach directly, that it needs a lot of ideological reinterpretations to approach it directly. And we also organized at that time, this was in 2007, we organized an archive which showed the reception of a Bakić, like from this figure who fought for artistic autonomy and for abstract art as epitomizing artistic autonomy, to completely dismissed artist in the 90s. But our research into Vojin Bakić was very much prompted by David Maljković practice, because he was engaged with his heritage since 2003 in a number of works, collages, installations, and videos. So this digression on Bakić was actually a background to the video that we will see now. And it's the first video in the Maljković series that deals with Vojin Bakić. It's called Scene for a New Heritage, and it's from 2004. And you will see in the video itself one of the major monuments of Vojin Bakić, which is still preserved. I mean, it's completely falling apart, but it still stands and has a chance maybe to survive. So let's see the video. Scene for a New Heritage, David Maljković. I just want to add here to the video the location of Petrova Gora, which was mentioned at the end, where the monument is. Monument is the monument to partisan hospital during the Second World War, which really resisted for 3 years fascist Nazi occupation. But even before that, it has a strong historical meaning that the first Croatian king in 11th century was killed there. So it has a lot of historical layers, the place itself. And the language they are using is a language devised by artists and is based on a folk song, particular for one region of Croatia, which is considered very backward and very backward. And this region was very prominent in the 90s, so it was also kind of reaction against urban racism, which was very much present in Croatia in the 90s. So not only nationalism and chauvinism, but also urban racism. So that's what the language is about. I would like to talk now very briefly before we finish about the self-organized platform and artist group called Što delat, or What's to be Done, from Russia. They are founded in 2003 in St. Petersburg, and they work with members coming from Moscow, Nizhny Novgorod, and St. Petersburg. And the name itself, What's to be Done, comes from Chernyshevsky pamphlet and from very famous Lenin's text. And they deal a lot with the legacy of Russian avant-garde and the tradition of Soviets. They publish newspapers which are distributed freely in the context of the exhibition, which are very often funded by the Western art institution. And they also publish the newspapers not only within the exhibition context, but at conferences, protests, and so on, and they have a strong link with activists. It comes as no surprise that in the depoliticized market glitter of contemporary art in Russia, the source of their authority and economic independence is displaced in the West, embedded in the network of non-profit institutions of critical culture. However, their projects aim to act as double agents. On the one hand, they deliver politicized content appropriately based on the methodological principles of the Russian avant-garde and the Soviets, while on the other, they revive the capacity of speech in the public sphere through focus on the crucial questions of political and intellectual Russian contemporary life. In the last years, they developed a series of collective video works called Songspiel Triptych, which is based on Bertolt Brecht form of operatic musical drama with aggressive popular song style. So based on Brecht method he developed with Kurt Weill in the 20s. These are some of David Maljković. I forgot to show it. In our gallery in Zagreb, some of his installations also dealing with Bakić and modernism, Croatian modernism. But this is one installation by Što delat, the one we showed in Istanbul, and here you can see the frame from one of these Songspiel. So the actors are actually singing the text written by members of Što delat. Very Brechtian works that deal with the specific set of problems, each one of them social problems. One is with gentrification in St. Petersburg, one is with memories of partisan struggle in Belgrade, and so on and so on. But here I wanted actually to mention another work by them, one very early work, quite early work from 2005, called Builders. And here you can see several images, but this one is maybe the most important. So the work is inspired by the painting The Builders of Bratsk, painting in social realist style from 1961 by Viktor Popkov, painting that depicts workers that, in the words of Što delat, became an iconographic symbol of self-possessed, concentrated people, not only standing on the brink of great changes, but capable of making sense of this transformation and realizing it. The members of the group arranged themselves in the composition of Popkov's painting and discussed collective self-representation and importance and potentials of appropriating the painting today, trying to bridge a gap to the past. As they say, our goal lies in constructing a situation in which people today, ourselves and our colleagues from Stodelat, become ideal, stretching to reach this image. So it's very much about self-representation and relation to the past. All these resurrections of the past I've been mentioning and discussing in this talk could also be understood as an attempt against tendencies to normalize a history. And here, perhaps in the context of this normalization, I would like to end with the video work by Swedish artist Johanna Billing, whose video called Magical World had been produced in Zagreb in 2005 in the context of our project called Normalization. The video was shot in a never fully completed building of a cultural center at the periphery of Zagreb, and it consists of a never-ending footage of children rehearsing the song from 1968 by Rotary Connection, a song called Magical World, and the song acts as an anthem for an uncertain future. Again, a musical piece of history, or piece of history this time, musical piece of history, is taken as a starting point to shed light on a country in transition and the community still recovering from the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. So now we see the video by Johanna Billing, and that's the end of my lecture, so thank you. Just let it go. Yeah. So this is Johanna Billing. There was no. Can you make it louder? As loud as possible. Can't hear really.
Why you wanna wake me from such a beautiful dream? Can't you see that I am sleeping? in a yellow submarine, and gliding down the shadows that was left of last night's sleep. In a magical world, in a magical world, in a magical world. I live in a magical world, in a magical world, in a magical world.
Dobro, onda to je to.
And it goes in a loop. But even now, forcefully stopping. Conceptually it goes in a
Vidite,